Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to the first installment of This Week in Magic the Gathering. This is episode 1. We're going to talk about the impact of Magic Origins on Standard now that we're through the first weekend that Magic Origins has been legal, and we did see a major tournament in the Star City Games Open in Chicago this past weekend. So basically the question is, these new cards, what kind of impact have they had? We're still a little ways away from the Pro Tour, so I'm sure a lot of these decks that we saw at Star City Games Open will be worked on and made more robust and perfected for the Pro Tour, but let's just jump in and kind of see what we saw this weekend. So if you take a look at the top 8 of this weekend's Open, not a whole lot of surprises in the top 8. Green Red Devotion took the number 1, 3, and 4 spots in the tournament. And number 2 was Blue White Heroic. So these are just very standard decks that have been, no pun intended, in standard for a while. Nothing new, nothing too exciting there. Some decks were playing one-ofs or sideboard cards of some of the Magic Origins cards, but for the most part, it was just the build that we've seen for quite some time in Standard. Same thing when you get to Abzan Control, Jeskai tokens, and even Mardu Dragons. Now, the first deck of maybe any interest that was a little bit different, a little bit offbeat, did come in 7th place. It was piloted by Jeff Hoagland, and it was a blue-white control deck, and we saw this, I think, in the Market Watch a little bit earlier in the week. There's been a lot of speculation around some of the white-blue control cards in Standard, and this is the deck that has been speculated on. So let's take a quick look at it. The big thing you'll notice here, Hangerback Walker did a lot of work. If you got a chance to watch the tournament this weekend, this card feels like this could be a Standard staple. It did a lot of great stuff in this control build. You can put it out really cheap early, then it can kind of grow. It costs mana to get bigger, but the control deck's got plenty of mana to use, and it just kind of works. Late game, it can come out and be a big creature, and then when it dies, or if you happen to be in a situation where there's board sweep or something like that, well, good news, now you got a ton of Thopter tokens. So this is really strong, and I think this is going to see a lot of Standard play. Now, when you go beyond that, you see your Planeswalkers like normal, your mana base pretty normal, but you do get 2 copies of Thopter Spy Network. And this is another card that did a lot of work. It really did feel almost in Standard Bitter Blossom-esque. Now, not quite as good, because it does cost 4. There's a big difference between putting this down on, say, a turn 4 as opposed to a turn 2. But still, it had a very powerful effect on the board, and if something that, if it wasn't dealt with, led to a game loss for the opponent. So, on top of that, we also saw some Artificer's Epiphanies show up. Clash of Wills made the cut. So a good amount of new cards in this deck. Let's look at another deck. This is called Big Red. It was piloted by Shane Campbell. This actually came in 16th place. And this is basically a red deck. It's not too different than things you've seen, but the reason I wanted to point it out was it did run 4 Paya and Karen Nalars, which I thought was kind of cool. And it also continued with things like Rabblemaster and Stormbreath Dragon, but then you also had like Foundry of the Console. So you had a couple of these little Thopter cards in here, and Pia and Karen were able to do some direct damage, and it was actually pretty cool. It was a very small adjustment to this type of deck. Other than that, you see your regular stuff like Chandra Pyromancer and Stoke the Flames and Dragon Fodders and that type of stuff. Roasts, of course, Lightning Strikes. But I thought those 2 cards, it was kind of interesting just to point that out. Next, let's talk about Goblins. So Goblins, a lot of people speculating were going to be a big thing. And Goblins did show up in the top 64 quite a few times. This is the deck that actually did the best. It came in 18th place. And this one's a little different than the other Goblin decks we saw. It kind of focuses on Atarka's Command, which is a very powerful card. Most of the other decks weren't running this. I'm not really sure why, because they probably should. But if you take a look at this, it's a Goblin deck. You got your Foundry Street Denizens, Frenzy Goblin, Heel Cutters are in these builds. Of course, here's your Goblin Pile Driver and Goblin Rabble Masters, which is what everyone expected. Monastery Swift Spear still making the cut. So pretty cool deck actually, and you can see, 4 Wooded Foothills, which is why this card has been going up in price recently, mostly because of this deck. And yeah, overall, the rest of the deck is just the stuff you kind of expect. You get your Dragon Fodders, your Hordeling Outbursts, your Wild Slashes, Stoke the Flames, Searing Bloods, kind of your normal burn stuff and some more Goblin support. But at the same time, very different deck, and like I said, these were relatively successful. Quite a few of them did show up in the top 64. Let's look at something different now. This is a deck that came in 34th place called 5-Color Rally. This was piloted by Matthew Tickle. And this is an interesting deck. Now, when you look at it, you probably are noticing, I don't see a lot of new cards, but there's a few. Jace, and I'll tell you, Jace was probably the most played Planeswalker in general that I noticed anyway in the coverage. It just seemed like everyone was playing Jaces. Mostly using him for the loot ability, although when he did flip, I mean, there is value to be had there, but for the most part, it felt like decks were including him so they could loot. You see a Liliana, one of her in this deck as well, but the big story here was actually Nantuko Husk, and this being reprinted had a huge effect and really made Rally the Ancestors playable. And here's where it got interesting. This was a very complicated deck, looked like a very difficult deck to play. There were times where I know Matthew had some trouble and I think made some gameplay mistakes. And it's very awkward, I think, when a new set comes out and you're trying so quickly to build a deck and get good at it that you saw this a lot in the tournament, not just with Matthew, but a lot of people did make mistakes playing some of these new cards and maybe lost a few games that they could have won. But this was a very difficult deck to pilot from what I saw. It basically depends on taking Rally the Ancestors to get a bunch of creatures back, and then instead of exiling them, sacrificing them to Nantuko Husk, which allows you to then be in a situation where you can draw a lot of cards with Grim Herapex, and then you get to do it all over again and hopefully find another Rally the Ancestors, and it kind of just goes off almost sort of kind of infinite. So pretty cool deck. You also had some Court of Callings in there to help move it along. Other than that, you had your creatures that are your staples. You got your Death Mist Raptors, you got your Den Protectors, you have your Mana Accelerants. So that part wasn't that surprising, but just the fact that Nantuko Husk really made Rally the Ancestors sort of work was kind of cool to see, and Jace was another engine to help you get to your pieces that you needed. Alright, so let's talk about Elves. Now, Elves didn't have quite as big of a showing as Goblins. Only one deck was in the top 64, and that was this one, which came in 41st place, piloted by John Ostrom. And it's your green-black elf build, kind of what people were expecting to see. And you can see here you get Dwennan's Elite, you get Elvish Visionary, you get Gnarlroot Trapper, you get Leaf Gilder, you get 2 of the legendary Dwayne Gilt's Leaf and Daeans. So a lot of new cards in this build. You get 4 of Sylvan Messenger shows up, of course 4 of Shaman of the Pack, and then as expected, you got your Court of Callings, your Collected Companies, and overall, I mean, even in the sideboard, you got Guiltleaf Winnower, so new cards are showing up there. Kind of what people were probably expecting. I kind of wish it had a little bit of a stronger showing. It would have been cool to see it show up a little more like Goblins did. But this is the first week. I'm sure this deck can be tweaked and get better. And still, 41st place for this version is still a pretty good showing. So hopefully there will be a place for Elves in Standard. So next, let's look at a deck that came in 64th place. And this is Mono White Devotion, so not a new deck by any means, but I think a lot of players have been trying to make Mono White Devotion work way back since Theros came out, and it always kind of fell short. Blue Devotion got there, Black Devotion certainly got there, Green and Green-Red Devotion is there right now, but White never quite took off, and here's a deck that maybe makes it viable. Now, it only came in 64th, but still, that's pretty good for such a sizable tournament. But it's just interesting. It is running 4 Archangel of Tides. It's running 4 Knight of the Wild Orchids, so I thought that was pretty cool. And then you're just getting, other than that, your kind of normal build. You got your Wingmate Rocks and Offenses in there. You have 4 Kythian, Hero of Akros, another pretty cool new card, seeing some play. And other than that, everything's kind of what you'd expect. So there it is. Don't know if it will be viable, but I do like it. It seems like a really fun build. Seems like it could be powerful, especially with the Knight of the White Orchids for a really strong start. Be interesting to keep an eye on this one and see if it does anything interesting. So last deck I want to point out, just because it was just so different, was a Turbofog deck. And Turbofog itself isn't very different. This came in 78th place, but this used a lot of new cards and is basically, even though it's called Turbofog, is basically a mill deck. And this was a very interesting kind of fun deck to watch. Now, this is the type of deck that if this were to take over Standard might make for a not great environment to watch game after game of, because it isn't the most interactive deck in the world, but I thought it was pretty interesting. So let's kind of take a look at it and see how it works. You have some things like your Orbs of Warding, which are going to give you hexproof, hopefully help you whittle out the game longer. And then you go into your card draw engines. You got Dictate of Crewfix, you got Monastery Siege, just really to draw you more cards. And then you got Sphinx's Tutelage, which is pretty much your win condition. So you're just milling out your opponent. And what's kind of fun about this deck is you're just drawing tons of cards, and you're milling, and you're drawing more cards, and you're milling. And how do you stay alive? Well, you stay alive with things like Ether Spouts, Defend the Hearth, Winds of Qualsisma. So that's where it kind of gets the Turbo Fog name, because you're basically turbo fogging. Drawing a lot of cards, drawing into these fogs, milling your opponent at the same time. Now, on top of that, you got cards like Negate to help protect you. There was a one-of Halamurat's Archive, which could speed things along. Of course, you got Treasure Cruise, just the best, most efficient card draw engine. And then here's where it gets interesting. You have 4 Days of Undoing. So how does this work in the deck? I think a lot of people were under the false impression originally glancing at this card that you could force your opponent to draw 7 cards, you draw 7 cards, and then if you have even just one Sphinx's Tutelage out, you're milling for quite a bit. But it actually doesn't work that way, because when Days Undoing gets onto the stack, it basically ends your turn. It ends all triggers. So when you draw those 7 cards, you can't force your opponent to mill off those. Those triggers get taken off the stack when Days Undoing resolves. So why is it in here then? Well, basically what happens is, and I did see there was one game on camera which was very interesting where James Newman, who was piloting the deck, he was able to almost get his opponent milled down. I think that his opponent had 2 or 3 cards left in his library, but he didn't have a fog in his hand. He would have lost the game. So now he has the Days of Undoing. So he basically has to start all over again. However, when he does that, I mean, he still has his enchantments in play, like his Sphinx's Tutelage. He gets to draw 7 new cards. Now he finds a fog, and he gets to put another Sphinx's Tutelage into play. So he has to mill his opponent's entire deck again, but it's that much easier the second time around, or the third time around, or the fourth time around. So even though it seems counterintuitive, like you almost won the game, but now you got to start milling all over again, you just start building so much more momentum the second time around when you already have your enchantments on the board. So he was able to actually mill out his opponent pretty quickly. So it was a very interesting deck, and you can look quickly at some of the sideboard here and just your normal defensive cards to kind of drag the game out. You got Ugin, the Dragonlord's Prerogative, another Ether Spouts. There is one of a Pearl Lake Ancient. There are some Icefall Regents. A Grind Clock shows up in there, so a couple Clash of Wills. Yeah, typical stuff for control. Also, there's 2 talents of the Telepaths in his deck as well, I'd assume maybe for the mirror match, if there was one, or control perhaps. So pretty cool deck, really kind of fun to see. It was just the most probably out there deck based off the new Magic Origins cards. And now we're at a point where we wait another, I guess, a little less than 2 weeks or week and a half, and we'll be at the point where we'll see the Pro Tour. And I think these are going to be some shells that will be flushed out, and so we might see some decks very similar to these of the Pro Tour. So we'll stay tuned for that. So having said that, that's this week in Magic the Gathering. However, if you guys have a moment, I'd like for you to put in the comments below topics you'd like to see in future episodes. And in some ways, this kind of feels a little bit like a podcast. There's going to be weeks where there's probably not a whole lot of news, and I will probably talk about some just standing topics. Like one thing I had in mind was like the reserve list, stuff like that. So if there's any topics in Magic the Gathering in general that you would like to see an episode on, feel free to put those in the comments below so that I have some ideas for the future. I like to make this a regular segment. Of course, spoilers always kind of come first when it is spoiler season and set review season, so those weeks I probably won't do an episode of this, but I'd like to do, on most normal weeks, at least one episode and kind of talk about some of the things going on in the game. So, as always, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks as always for watching. If you're still looking for quality Magic the Gathering videos, click on one of these annotations. And if you hadn't had a chance yet to subscribe, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the breaking MTG news, spoilers, set reviews, crazy product openings, or gameplay videos on Heroes and Legends MTG. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.